So with the fall of the Republic and the rise of the Galactic Empire, many Republic institutions had to transition into new versions of themselves to fit the new galactic government. And one large institution that did make this transition was the Republic Senate. So today we're going to talk about the transition from the Republic Senate to the Imperial Senate. I'm Colin, and this is Sci-Fi Deep Dive. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, to head down below and hit that subscribe button. So we're all very familiar with the Republic Senate. They play a really big role in the prequels as one of the main political entities within the government of the Galactic Republic. But the Imperial Senate has been a little bit more of an afterthought through most of Star Wars history. We're starting to see more of them with shows like Andor and The Bad Batch, but that's really some of the first times we've ever seen them on screen. The first mention of the Imperial Senate actually was way back in the original Star Wars in 1977, when it is casually mentioned that the Imperial Senate was dissolved with the completion of the Death Star. But what exactly was the Imperial Senate, and what was this transition from the Republic Senate to the Imperial Senate? So the Senate is a large body of elected representatives from across the galaxy, elected by their respective star systems and sectors to represent those entities within the galactic government. And during the days of the Republic, the Senate held real significant legislative power. But with the rise of the Empire, the responsibilities of the Senate changed, and it changed rather quickly. While the Senate as an institution remained in place, their powers were significantly curtailed in favor of more powers for the executive branch, being the Emperor. Nearly immediately, with the declaration of a new order and the adoption of the Imperial Constitution, the Senate would become a toothless organization that really couldn't affect policy without the Emperor's approval and could easily be overridden if they had done something that was not to the liking of the Emperor. And while that shift was a major political shift that changed sort of the role the Senate played in the Imperial government, it didn't actually change the way the Senate itself worked, at least not immediately. In the early days, the Imperial Senate tried to function the way they did during the Galactic Republic, with senators still showing up and debating topics, including decisions that would affect the course of galactic policy. One early example of this was the decision to transition from clone troopers to recruited stormtroopers, and this is, I think, a perfect example of how the powers and capabilities of the Imperial Senate was different from the Republic Senate. During the Clone Wars, we see the Senate basically vote to approve the construction of more clone units. And it's worth mentioning that that decision actually carried weight. It affected the Republic troop numbers for the rest of the war. But when that same choice, or a similar choice, came to the Imperial Senate in their early days, things went a little bit differently. Well, the Senate was ultimately manipulated to play in the Emperor's favor, voting to replace the clones with recruited stormtroopers. It was very clear that the Imperial military was already well onto this path of replacing the clones with recruited soldiers. So even if the Senate had voted against it, I'm sure there would have been some workaround that the executive branch of the Empire could have used to basically just override the Senate. And that became more and more apparent to the senators as those tools were used. This led to the Imperial Senate starting to thin out. In the early days, we see a packed Senate chamber, very similar to what we saw during the Clone Wars, where the Senate was full of representatives from all across the galaxy. But as time went on, by the time we reached shows like Andor, we see a Senate chamber that is nearly empty, with only a few senators still showing up to do their jobs, as many of them feel like their jobs are pointless now, and have just returned home to their people, or straight up decided to just take the paycheck and stay in their cushy Coruscant apartments. As such, the Imperial Senate did start to look significantly different from what it looked like during the Republic. Not only were there the aesthetic changes of a slight light color change and the addition of Imperial emblems on all of these Senate seats, but there were the practical changes that most of the senators had simply stopped coming to work. And this was the state that the Senate was in when the Emperor formally dissolved them following the construction of the Death Star. Now, the idea behind that was that they no longer needed the Senate. The Senate was ultimately a tool to make the worlds of the galaxy feel like they were part of the Imperial government. But with a tool like the Death Star, they could just strike fear into the hearts of these worlds and not have to worry about whether or not they felt like they were actually part of the governmental process. So while we often think of the Senate as a Republic institution, it did continue on past the end of the Republic and into the reign of the Empire, and it did actually hold some sway for those first few years of Imperial rule. And one early decision that the Imperial Senate made was the transition from clone troopers to TK troopers, which would eventually become the standard Imperial stormtroopers. If you'd like to learn about the TK troopers, this sort of in-between unit in between the clones and the regular recruited stormtroopers we see in the original trilogy, I'll leave a link up here to my video on that. And I'd like you to let me know down in the comments whether you think the Senate was actually allowed to hold any power during the days of the Empire. Do you think there were rules that the Senate could have enforced, even against the Emperor's will? Or do you think they were always just there as a symbolic gesture to the people of the galaxy to make them feel like they were part of the governmental process? And if you have anything else you'd like to see me cover in Star Wars, you can let me know down below in the comments. Last but not least, if you enjoyed this video, head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon to get notified when I upload new videos. So for Sci-Fi Deep Dive, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.